Hello and welcome to the SOC 3 Module 5 video lecture. This week we'll be focusing on Chapter 3 of Asking the Right Questions, entitled Elements of Arguments, Issues, and Conclusions. And we're also going to discuss the Farkas reading entitled The Black-White Test Score Gap as a way to apply what Brown and Keeley are teaching us to do in Chapter 3. So the first step in evaluating arguments as a critical thinker is simple but not always easy, and that is identifying the issue. So first of all, what is an issue? An issue is simply a question, controversy, or topic of discussion that the author is talking about in whatever it is that you're reading or watching. So there are several clues you can use to identify an issue. You can just simply look at the title. Most authors will give their books, their journal articles, their newspaper articles, whatever it is that you're trying to identify the issue in, they'll give it a title that's very indicative of what the issue is that they're focusing on. Another clue you can use is look at the subheadings. So subheadings are the titles of the different sections in the text, and identify if there's a common theme. That's a good clue. And then last, see if there are any images that are associated with the text. This is much more common in books and newspaper articles, not so much in journal articles. But all the readings for this class, in addition to the asking the right questions, have images in the text that are really nice clues that can help you figure out what the issue is. So as Brown and Keeley argue, there are really two major types of issues, two categories, descriptive and prescriptive. And I know those words sound very similar, but they mean very different things. Descriptive issues really raise questions about the accuracy of descriptions. They're more factual statements. So an example here is, does critical thinking help us make better decisions? Prescriptive issues are really about what's right or wrong, good or bad, desirable or undesirable, things we should or shouldn't do. An example here is, should we require critical thinking classes in college? So issues that authors are writing about will generally fall into those two categories. The next thing we need to do is, once you've identified the issue, the main issue, is identify the conclusion. So the conclusion, the author's conclusion, is the message or claim about the issue that the speaker or writer wants you to accept. So several questions that you can ask yourself to help you figure out what the conclusion is. What is the speaker or writer trying to prove? What argument are they trying to make? What is their main point, right? What is their thesis statement? And which stance on the issue is she or he trying to get you to accept? What is he or she trying to convince you of? If you can identify that, and some authors are very explicit, my argument is, it's a really good clue that you've identified the conclusion. Some additional clues for identifying conclusions are, consider the issue. What claim about the issue is the author making? Look for what Brown and Keeley call indicator words, such as consequently, thus, therefore, this evidence shows that. Look in likely locations. Most of the time, authors at either the beginning of the piece or the end will explicitly state what their conclusion on a topic is. And then finally, consider the context and the author's background. Are there any probable biases or perhaps institutional affiliations that may predict the author's stance? So for example, does he or she work for an organization that promotes certain types of programs or policies? If you can figure out the stance of the organization that he or she is working on for, that's usually a good indicator of what their stance on an issue will likely be. There's several things that a conclusion is not, and it's really helpful to be able to say, okay, so I can identify sentence as this, so I know it's not the conclusion, and those include examples. So if an author's trying to give you an example of something, that's usually not the conclusion. Any kind of statistic, half of all marriages will end in divorce, will likely not be the author's conclusion. Any kind of definitional statement where an author is just defining a key term is often not the conclusion. Background information on a topic, and really anything that we could consider evidence. So things like statistics, that's usually a form of evidence that an author is providing. So if you can identify something as falling in any of these categories, that's also a pretty big clue that it's not the author's main conclusion. So what I want us to do is I want us to take this critical thinking question, what is the issue and what is the conclusion? And I want us to apply it to the other reading for this week, Farkas's The Black-White Test Score Gap. So in some ways, I think it's really easy to pick out the issue and the conclusion in this reading. In other ways, I think it's very difficult, which is why I assigned it for this week. It's also a very important reading about a very, very important social issue in our society today, and I want to give you just a little bit of background about that. So this reading is going to teach you a lot on education, race, and educational inequality in particular. So there are vast racial disparities in all measures of academic achievement, and scholars who study this issue, sociologists, sometimes political scientists, certainly education scholars, refer to these disparities. So disparity really means difference. It's another word for difference. This is often referred to as the racial achievement gap. And this is one of the forms of institutionalized racial inequality that is still very rife in our society. We do not give equal opportunities and equal access to resources to members of all racial and ethnic groups. And you can probably think of many, many examples where you yourself have noticed this. But this is certainly true in education. We know that there are significant racial differences in standardized test scores. So as Farkas talks about, African American students overall as a group tend to score significantly lower than white students. And this also tends to lead to big racial differences in high school graduation rates. African Americans are significantly less likely to graduate from high school. And you can think of this as a cycle. They ultimately end up being much less likely to graduate from college. And I have this arrow here because if you think about it, if they're not as likely to graduate from high school or college, this can have significant impact on other life chances. And we see a lot of evidence of this. African Americans tend to have significantly higher unemployment rates. In the United States, the unemployment rate of African Americans is typically at least twice that of whites. So really big racial differences here. That also tends to lead to differences in what are called family formation patterns. So lower marriage rates, higher divorce rates. So this can have an impact on our personal lives as well. And then also higher incarceration rates. We know that African Americans and especially African American men and Latino men, not only are they targeted by the criminal justice system, which is something that we will talk about in another reading for this course, but we know that one of the biggest predictors of whether or not someone will be incarcerated is their education and whether or not they have stable, well-paying employment. And as Farkas talks about, a lot of these forms of social inequality do go back to very early differences in language development and test scores. So let's use this critical thinking question, this critical thinking skill we've just been talking about, to identify the issue in this reading. So I'm going to walk you through it. So what is the issue here? Just what is Farkas talking about? This one is an example of where the title is incredibly helpful, the black-white test score gap. And if you picked out that that was the issue, ding, ding, you are indeed right. But for whatever reason, if you were thinking, okay, I just want to double check myself here, if you go through the Farkas reading, look at some of the subtitles. The first one is the gap real, page 13. Recent evidence, and if you read that section, it's recent evidence on the gap. Continuing on here in the reading, I'm flipping through it. Which explanations are best supported? If you read that subsection, you know he's talking about which explanations are best supported for the gap. And then finally, how the gap can be closed. And then the clock is ticking. So if there's a common theme in all of these subheadings, it is indeed the black-white test score gap, and specifically what explains it. If you wanted another clue, you can look through the images, right, and see what it is the images evoke. And in most cases, that's either statistical evidence that they're giving you. There's one of a mother reading to her young child, and there's one actually of African American students walking up to a school after a desegregation case. So the images might not have been quite as helpful, but certainly the title and the subheadings. And so in terms of, is this issue descriptive or prescriptive, what's really interesting about the Farkas reading is that it could be both, right? Because he's talking about descriptively what is the gap, so that's a matter of fact. What explains it, but he also at the end is talking about what it is that we should do about it. So when you start asking what should we do, what's a good or bad solution for a social problem, that's where you're really in that prescriptive category. So last, what we're going to do is we're going to identify the conclusion in this reading. So ask yourself, what stance on the black-white test score gap is Farkas really trying to convince you, the reader, to accept? And he talks at the beginning of the reading about various dominant explanations that have been offered to explain the gap. So test bias, teacher bias, stereotype threat, which basically means that's a concept developed by a social psychologist, Claude Steele, that finds that people who think that taking a test and their score on that test will reflect some kind of inferiority of either their racial or gender group, that they actually tend to do less well on an exam when they think that people are going to stereotype them. And there's actually, if you're interested in that concept, it's a really interesting concept. There's more about that in the reading. And even genetic explanations have been offered. That a lot of people who still claim very, very incorrectly, the genetic differences between African Americans and whites explain the gap. And I want to be very clear on this point. The sociological evidence and almost all evidence in all fields do not find that African Americans are in any way genetically, intellectually inferior. So that's been one that in sociology has definitely been discredited as an explanation. But the question here, right, what's the conclusion? Well, he keeps talking about these competing explanations because, again, right, the issue, the black-white test score gap, but he's also trying to explain it, right? So this should be a good clue to you that the conclusion is somehow about him trying to explain why that gap exists. And if you note, there's some sentences that I've identified on 17 and 18 that is really the explanation. You want to ask yourself, what explanation or explanations does he keep coming back to? And if you read the article carefully, he does come back to the claim that what's happening is most of the differences in social class. So we know that African Americans overall tend to make less money, have less income, which is highly predictive of their educational access and whether or not they'll graduate. So a lot of it has to do with class, but he argues a lot of it has to do with family structure and specifically child rearing behaviors, especially the tendency for white parents, especially white mothers, to read more frequently to their children. So as he says on page 17, research supports the idea that black-white differences in social class, family structure, so that refers to whether families are headed by a single parent or a married couple, and child rearing behaviors explain much of the test score gap. And he also reiterates on page 18, thus culture and child rearing, differing by class and by race, there's the class issue again, and operating from birth to adulthood, complete the explanation for the black-white test score gap. So ultimately what this means, the issue, the black-white test score gap, but the conclusion is, right, what explains the gap? And according to Farkas, his conclusion is that child rearing practices and income explain much of the gap between overall differences in the test scores of African Americans versus whites in the United States. And so hopefully that was a helpful exercise to allow you to start practicing identifying the issue and conclusion, a very important critical thinking skill. There are additional examples in the Brown and Keeley text that if you want more practice on this, you can look towards. And also we are going to do this over and over and over again. You are going to get so good at identifying the issue and conclusion. But hopefully this practice exercise with the Farkas reading, not only did you learn a little bit about racial inequality in the United States, but it's a good start to helping you develop that key critical thinking skill. So that's the end of our lecture for this module, and I'll see you again soon.